So yeah, thank you for coming. I'm sorry we were just a little bit behind, but I appreciate everybody coming out. I am JC Hyatt. I am from Jackson, Mississippi. So a little bit of a ways away. I actually flew here from San Diego, oddly enough. Haven't been home in like 10 days, so I get to go home tomorrow and see my wife. I'm excited about that. This is my first time in Denver, first time in Colorado, and I feel like I'm probably not going to do it justice because I hear it's beautiful, but I'm pretty much going to be here, and anyway, so hopefully I'll get to come back soon. So yeah, like I said, I'm from Mississippi. I work at a company called Echobind. We're a 100% remote agency. We work with a lot of technology companies and companies in the life sciences and healthcare spaces. And we are hiring. So if you are looking for a new gig, specifically if you have React or React Native experience, I would love to chat with you. I will be around all day. I'll be around all night until the party is over. So come and find me. I would love to chat with you. And also, we, like I said, do a lot of work in the healthcare, life science, technology spaces. So if you need some consulting, come and chat with me. So today, we want to go over React hooks. Who here has heard of hooks but is not using them in production? Okay, good. Good. So people, like, my talk's actually going to like help people. Who here has been writing hooks for a while and is writing them in production every day? Okay, gotcha. Cool. So this talk is probably going to be more of a refresher for you, and this is kind of geared towards people who might have just heard of it and need to kind of learn the concepts. So I will not be offended if you need to get up and leave. I totally understand. But for the rest of you, I'm hopefully, but by the time this talk is over, hopefully you will understand what hooks are, why they were introduced, and how you can start using them today. So first off, what are hooks? Straight from the React docs, hooks allow us to use state and other React features without writing a class component. So everyone who writes React, you've probably seen a class component before. You've probably written quite a few. So this is just like a little bit of pseudocode, but the concept is we extend React's class, component class, and we need this historically until now. We need this if we want to add some state or use a lifecycle method like component did mount to fetch some data, and obviously render is what we always want to call in every React class component. So we actually put something out to the UI. And if we kind of drill down with this example further, hopefully, can everybody see that? Yeah. Okay, cool. So you've probably seen something like this. You've probably written something like this. You've got a class component that acts as like a container. Some people call these smart components. It's kind of been around for a while. And the class is responsible for holding state and for fetching data with lifecycle methods and all that good stuff, and ultimately returning a component that is actually your UI with the data that it fetched. And so down here at the bottom, we have a function component that would accept that data and actually display it. So the function component knows nothing about the data that got fetched or the state that the container is holding. All it knows is I get props, I display them. We came to call these dumb components stateless functional components, presentational components, like people never really made up their minds. But all of that is it's the same thing. But with React hooks, we no longer have to have this separation. We can actually utilize React state, and we can also utilize lifecycle methods like component did mount, component did update, component will unmount, and more without having to write a class component. And we'll get to like why we want to do that soon. It's also worth mentioning the availability. This has been out for, it was introduced almost a year ago at ReactConf, and it actually got merged in and is official as of 16.8, which I believe is like February or March. So it's been out for a while. And it's available in React Native as 0.59. So you can start using it immediately if you're able to update React. Just make sure you also update all of React's packages like React DOM or whatever. So let's get into the why a little bit, because conceptually it's like, okay, cool, I don't have to write a class component, but like, why does this matter? So first off, complex components become hard to maintain and debug. So who here has seen or added to a massive class component that has lots of different state, all in that one state object. A lot of the fields that may not even relate to each other. You have lots of logic, all kind of sprinkled through different lifecycle methods. Everybody has, who here has contributed to a mess? I have. So the thing about this is the class, in this kind of like pattern, I guess, the classes can become bloated, these class components, and sometimes they have to be because you have so many things that kind of needs to sort of be co-located. And the only boundary separating things is the lifecycle methods. Like it's not the logic itself, right? So if we look at an example here, zoom in, see a little too much. Right. So this is actually from the React docs. You can find this there too in the hooks examples. So they have this friend status with counter, and in the constructor we have some state, and we keep track of a count, which later you'll see is the example is there's basically a button, what I would imagine is a button. They didn't actually have it in the example, but every time you click it, it increments the count, and that's all that state field is used for. And you also have this is online state field, and these two fields are unrelated. One just cares about some button on the screen, and one cares about whether or not this user is online in this chat API that we're going to hit. And then if we scroll down a little bit, we have component did mount, and we have two things going on here. We modify the document title every time when the component mounts with the current count, and we subscribe to a chat API somewhere. These two things are completely unrelated, right? But we have to co-locate them because you can't use component did mount twice in a class. Like it's just, you only get one instance of that method. You can only call it one time. And so you have to kind of shove all the logic that relates to mounting in this one lifecycle method. And component did update. We want to update them for some reason. I've never done this, but for some reason they want to update the document title, and there are use cases for this, I'm sure. They want to update every time that count increments. So every time this component updates, we want to recall this. And then the component will unmount. They unsubscribe from that chat API. And this kind of sucks because this is not that big, but imagine a 300, 400, 500 line class component with tons of different logic in it that for some reason, either due to maybe either ignorance or necessity, you had to shove all this in one class component. It could just be poor design, or it could be necessity. But the things that relate to the chat API are separated, and they're separated by the lifecycle methods. They can't be co-located, so this really drastically degrades our readability of our components and maintenance of them. It's really easy to make a change and forget to make a change somewhere else. Like what if the way that we subscribe or unsubscribe from the chat API suddenly changes, and we make the necessary modification to the subscribe, but we don't for the unsubscribe? Like then we still have to go chase down where is this bug happening, and then ultimately figure out that we need to do some more cleanup, and a component will unmount. And so this is what React hooks will solve. React hooks will let us split our components into smaller functions and co-locate our concerns into, and they're not limited to a lifecycle method. They're just limited to a function. So you can make a function that will kind of close over all of the logic for a particular feature or concern. And we'll get to this in an example soon. Another reason that that they wanted to make hooks is sharing component logic is difficult. In the past, so back in the early days of React, we had mixins. I didn't have mixins because I've not been around in React that long. I hear that I'm fortunate that I did not have mixins. But mixins were, from my research, they were fragile. They were a way of extending functionality and kind of sharing it between components, but it was really hard to discern where certain functionality was coming from. You had like name collisions happening and stuff like that. And so they were really fragile and very hard to debug. And also, so React was out before ES6 was actually standardized and the class was introduced. And so React was kind of maintaining their own class model that they had just built themselves with React.createClass. And they decided that since ES6 classes were coming out and the whole spirit of React is to use just JavaScript where possible, that they would not maintain their own class abstraction. They'll just use the one that the language gives us. And so it was not idiomatic. So they ultimately favored moving away from mixins. The community came up with a couple of other solutions. So first off, higher order components. Is anyone familiar with higher order component? Yeah, I've written quite a few of them myself. If you're not, higher order component is a component that takes a component as a prop, and then it sprinkles some new functionality into it and returns the same component, but now it's like enhanced, right? And so a lot of this you'll see a component that starts with the word with, like with with styles or with authentication or whatever it may be. That's a higher order component. It's if you see it, it's probably going to have a child, or you might even call it as a function sometimes. And what you pass in, or what the child component of it will be the component that you want to enhance with that functionality. So it'll take it and it'll spit it back out with new things. But this was fragile too, because what happened is these are components. They're composable by nature because React components are just functions and they are composable by nature. And this wasn't a bad thing, but and it's not bad with only 2 or 3. But if you compose 8, 10, 12 higher order components together, and you pass this one component through 12 levels, it gets a little bit of functionality sprinkled in at every level, and finally you get this superhuman component. That's cool, but you still can run into some issues where you don't know what functionality came from where, or you might have name collisions with props, because a lot of times higher order components are going to kind of add some props to the component that you pass in. And so they're inherently still fragile, just like mixins were. They also have some mental overhead because, again, you don't know what's coming from where, and the more that you use, you have to figure out what's coming from where. You have to kind of crawl through multiple files, and so there's some mental overhead there. They also required you to restructure your component tree. Because they're components themselves, you have to actually include them like in your markup in your JSX. And this led to what was known as wrapper hell. So if you open React DevTools, you've probably seen in many apps, every app I've ever written, I know, and probably many apps that you've written, you're going to see so many levels of nested components. And a lot of them are just higher order components that really aren't putting anything on the screen. They're not rendering a UI. They're just there for the purpose of enhancing components. But because they are components themselves, they're still in your tree. And so there's a lot of overhead, mental overhead, with trying to discern your component tree when you're looking at it in DevTools. Render props was another example, and that was the one that everybody thought was going to solve all the problems. But they had a lot of mental overhead themselves, because the way render props worked, or still works, all this stuff still works. Even mixins, if you use create class, you can still use mixins if you want. But the way render props worked is you pass in a function as a prop, and then you call that function in the component that you're passing in, and it figures out what to render and gives you back some stuff to render. And this was a pretty good way of sharing logic, but it still has mental overhead. You still have things going on in multiple files that you have to trace through, and it still is just kind of messy, in my opinion. Reading in the actual markup of your vendors is kind of messy, because you've got these like random functions all of a sudden where you call a component, and then all of a sudden you just see like a function, and you get some stuff from it, and you put out more components, and it doesn't read very well, in my opinion. And it's also kind of muddying up your JSX with stuff that still isn't really putting anything on the screen, right? And so I would love it if my renders is just really the UI, so I can easily read through it. So with hooks, you can reuse stateful logic without changing the structure of your component tree. So this is why this is such a big deal. You don't have to change the way that your component tree is structured. You don't have to worry about things like that. You can just you're able to reuse logic between components without having to worry about that. And so wrapper hell is gone. One last reason why they made hooks. Classes present issues for people and machines. So first off, with classes, there's a bigger learning curve. With classes, you have to have at least a basic knowledge of this and binding, things like that. And there's a lot of boilerplate and things like that maybe, even Stack Overflow, you can figure out what to do whenever you can still be productive. But it's still, and these are concepts that I do believe everyone should learn at a certain point in their career. But I do think this made React less approachable, less like junior friendly, because you have to learn that there's all this baggage that comes with classes. You have to learn binding in this, and or you're going to have a harder time debugging. And so there's that. There's also classes are harder to optimize with compilers. And so has anyone heard of Svelte? Yeah, a few people. Like it's fairly well, it's not new, but the mind-blowing one is fairly new. Svelte is a JavaScript library. It's another interface library similar to React, and it is introducing this idea of ahead of time compilation of your UI. And so there's a lot of big performance benefits out of that. But with classes, and Facebook has been working on a compiler called Prepack for I think a couple of years now. It's still not really ready. But as they've been experimenting with that on React, they found that classes are much harder for compilers to optimize. So classes don't minify very well. And this is kind of more of a deeper issue of just how classes are built in JavaScript. They're built on top of prototypes and just all this like patched work that's been done over the past 20 years. So they're really hard to optimize. And if React wants to kind of explore the new frontier of maybe ahead of time compilation and get those performance benefits, then we're going to have to start to move away from classes. You might ask yourself, so I can't use classes anymore? And you totally can. There are no plans to remove classes from React currently, and also hooks are 100% opt-in. So you can go back to your code bases today. You can write a component. You can write some components in hooks. You can continue writing some components in classes, and they're going to work side by side. And actually, in some cases, you still have to use classes. The most obvious one for me is error boundaries. There actually is no way to implement an error boundary with hooks. You still have to use classes because there is no hook for the component did catch lifecycle method. Now let's get into the how. Because all this is probably like abstract. So like let's actually build something. So we're going to build a timer component with hooks. And I'm going to live code. We'll see how this goes. So I've got this timer component. It does nothing right now. I've just got some styles. And we're going to add this functionality with hooks. So let's see. So I've got a base create React app install. Can everybody see? Okay. I have a base create React app install. I haven't done anything fancy, anything special. I've added some base styles. Removed a few of the boilerplate files, and I do have a cheat sheet in here in case I get stuck, in case this is a disaster, and the finished product in case it's a disaster. But we're going to start here and see where we end up. All right, so this is a function component. All I've done so far is add some classes so that we have those base styles you saw. I haven't done anything else. And so the first thing we want to do, think through the state of like what kind of state do we actually need for this component? What does it do? So if we kind of look in our JSX here, we're going to see, well, we're displaying the count as it's incrementing, as it's counting for us. So we're probably going to need a state field to track the seconds that it's counting. And also, if we want to be able to start, pause, reset, things like that, we need to know whether the timer is running, right? So we're going to add two state fields. In React, in hooks, you can add a state field by importing the useState hook. It's pretty aptly named. And I'm going to come back to the left side in a second. So we'll start on the right side and then we'll name it. And so I'm going to say useState. And the argument that you're going to pass into useState is the initial state for this field, All right, and this is one field, so it's different than class components where you just have a state object, like this.state equals object, and you got everything in there. This is really just one of those fields that would be in that state object. So for this, I count from 0, and I think the timer is going to be expected that our timer counts from 0, and so our initial state is going to be 0. You can pass any primitive, any JavaScript primitive into use state. You can pass an array, an object, a number, a string, whatever it might be. And what use state does is we're asking React to, hey, please take this piece of data, this 0, keep track of it for me in between renders, and give me a way to see the value anytime I want, or update the value at any time I want. And so what use state gives us, it actually returns an array, right? So we can destructure the array. If I wanted to, I could say, whatever we want to call this, like seconds, and then I could say const sex equals seconds 0 or something like that. But because we are getting an array back, but what we really want to do and what you're going to see in those code bases is you're going to see array destructuring. And so the first index that you're going to get back is the value itself and the value that you can use to keep track of, as React keeps track of that value for you. So we're going to call that seconds. You can call it whatever you want. If you're unfamiliar with array destructuring, you can name this value whatever you want. The second index in the array that use state gives us is a state updater function to update that piece of state. So generally, you can still call this whatever you want, but generally, the convention is set and then the name of the variable. So we'll do set seconds. We're going to need one more. We're going to need something to know if our timer is running. So we'll say const, and I'm going to call this is active, and set is active for the updater function. And we'll say the initial state is not active, right? So we haven't done anything yet. I'm going to go ahead and replace this 0 down here with our actual variable, so that that's dynamic. And if we go back, nothing has happened. We're not actually doing anything yet. We don't have any way to start the timer. So we probably need to build that next. So I want to create a couple functions that these buttons can use as on-click handlers. So first off, for the start button, I want a function that can toggle the state, because when it started, I want to change the button to say pause, so you can pause it, and vice versa. So I'm going to call this toggle. And all toggle is going to do is use the set is active state updater. And we're going to always set it to the opposite of what is active currently is. Okay? And then I can pass that down here for one click. Okay. Right? And then for the reset, we really, when you click the reset button, what do we want to actually happen? Like, we want basically the initial state the timer to be reset to the initial state. So we want seconds to go back to 0, and we want is active to go back to false. So we'll say function reset, and we will set seconds to 0, and set is active to false, all right? And then we can also pass that in here. All right, now I know that we need one more thing for this button. We need some styles because I have some active styles, so I'm just going to grab that real quick. And I'll show you what I actually did. So I didn't change anything except adding a couple of things to the class name so that when it's active, we can add a class so that it becomes yellow and things like that. And then I changed it so that the text will be start or pause depending on if the timer is active or not. All right, so now if I hit save, I'm going to go back. When I hit start, it's not going. We haven't written anything for it to actually count for us yet, right? But we should get a yellow. I did not get a button. Uh-oh. see. If anyone sees the issue, let me know. Lucky for us, I have some stuff that I can copy and paste. Live coding is it's not fun sometimes. Let's see, let's also restart this to be safe. There we go. All right, there we go. Disaster averted. Yeah, let's figure that out actually. So,
I think it was just the yard.
you think this is just the server?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks, Yarn. You worked every time I rehearsed, and anyway, all right. So cool. So we're back on track. So now we have a button. We can tell that things are happening. React is managing that state for us. Our toggle function is working. Now we actually want to count, right? So we're going to come back up here. And anytime that you want to perform a side effect from a component, you want the component to reach out to the application or to the DOM or to an API, or whatever it might be, anything that's not in relevant to the UI right there of that component. That's a side effect, right? And so anytime you want to do that with hooks, there's another aptly named hook called useEffect. And useEffect, as you'll see in a second, actually effectively replaces component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. All three lifecycle methods. But you can have multiple useEffects in a component. So I can call a useEffect. Back in that original example, I could make a useEffect for the document.title stuff that incremented the count every time you click the button. I could have that in one useEffect, and then I could have another useEffect in the same component for the chat API stuff. So now my concerns are grouped together instead of being separated by lifecycle methods. So it's way easier to read and reason about. So let's build this. So we're going to say useEffect. All right, and useEffect, the first argument is going to be a callback function. And this function is going to get executed every time useEffect runs, or useEffect runs unless you tell it not to. UseEffect is going to run after every render. So as soon as the render is finished, the effects are going to be executed. And we can, there's a second argument to useEffect, and that is a dependency array, which basically is saying anytime, any value I give this, only run this effect after the render if one of these values changed. So we don't, this is effectively component did update, where you used to have component did update, and then you would compare a bunch of previous state to the new state, and if something changed, you would do some stuff. And so it's much simpler, because now I know that if this component is ever re-rendered for some reason, I don't really want this effect that we're about to write to trigger unless seconds for is active have changed, right? So we'll pass that in, right? Now, the body of the callback function is what actually gets ran every time a render occurs and one of these values have changed. And then whatever you return from this function is actually what's going to be ran whenever this component is unmounting. So that's basically your cleanup. That's a component will unmount. So all three of those are kind of rolled into one here, which is pretty cool. So first off, we're going to know that, we know that we need an interval because, that's kind of like the most obvious solution for counting, because an interval, JavaScript just gives it to us natively, and it can just run for us every second. It's very similar to a set timeout, but if you set interval, it'll continuously run your callback until you clear it. So we're going to initialize one. All right. And what I want to do first is I want to check if this effect is running, then it means that one of these two values just changed, right? And so the first thing I want to do is I want to know, has is active changed, and is it now true? Like, is the timer running? Did the user click this button to start the timer? So we're going to check is active, right? And if the timer is active, we are going to set up our interval. So interval will equal set interval. And if you are new to set interval, it's very similar to set timeout. It's going to take a callback function, right? And then it's going to take as a second parameter the duration that you want this interval to run on. So I want this to run every second, so I'm going to say 1,000 milliseconds. And what I actually want to do every 1,000 milliseconds, I want to update my seconds state field so that the UI updates, right? And I'll know that if the UI is updating and I update seconds, that's going to cause this effect to continue running, right? So we're going to say set seconds, and what I want to set seconds to is whatever seconds is currently plus 1. And this is great because we already have access to seconds. Like all this is all in this one component. So hooks heavily takes advantage of JavaScript closures, but you don't have to know what that is to still take advantage of hooks, which is nice. So yeah, next, I also want to know if they paused it. So if they were to pause it, we don't want our interval to continue running under, like, kind of in the background if they've paused the timer, because then if they started it again, well, now we have 2 intervals running and you're going to get some really weird behavior where it's actually going to start incrementing the seconds twice every time it updates. So what we really want to do is make sure that we want to check if they've hit pause. And so the way we would do that is if it's not active, but the seconds is not 0, right? This means it was running, it's no longer active, they've clicked that button, but the seconds are not 0, so they've paused it. So here we'll just clear our interval. And this is how you do it in JavaScript. You just run clear interval, pass in the name of your interval, and it won't keep executing in the background. And lastly, we're responsible developers, and so we're going to do some cleanup. We don't want a memory leak in our application, and so when this component unmounts, we want to also make sure that we clear any running intervals. So if you want, whatever you want to do when it unmounts, you return a function, and that's what's going to get executed when this component unmounts, okay? So we want to clear interval, same thing. All right, that was a lot of code, so let's actually go back and look at it. So we click start, it's timing, and I think it's gonna work. I pause it. That interval, just take my word for it, is not running in the background anymore. And I still have my seconds. We're not resetting seconds because they haven't hit reset. And if I hit start, then it's going to set up a new interval. And it's going to keep going again, right? And then if I hit reset, it clears the interval too, right? Let's see. So lastly, am I good on time?
Yeah, bud.
Okay, cool. So lastly, there's other hooks, and if I had 4 hours, we would go through all of them. But these are the 2 you're going to use all the time. These are the 2 most common ones you're going to use, and I'll kind of point you to some resources for others. But the other cool concept, the other big thing about hooks that I want to make sure you walk away with is you can make custom hooks. And so this is where you start to share the functionality between components. And so if we wanted to, I don't know why, but if we wanted to make this into a custom hook, we could do that. So custom hooks are functions that you have to call within a React component. You need to call them in a React component. They don't need to be defined in a React component. And as long as they're called from a React component, you can take advantage of the hooks. And so the convention for a custom hook is the word use and something else, right? And this is, so React's, they have a linter that can help you kind of make sure that you're using this responsibly, or that make sure you're not doing anything that's just not going to work. And so if we want to use timer, we'll make a function, and we'll actually move all of this logic. So all of our use state, our toggle, and our effect, and our reset. We can actually move all this out into use timer. Okay. So all I've done is copy and pasted, haven't changed anything, and now we've got our timer. It's no longer has access to those values, right? And we need those. So we'll say const we'll use seconds is active, toggle, and reset, and we'll use timer. Now, use timer doesn't return anything, so we need to make sure we go up here and return an array so it can be destructured, right? Right? If I hit save, nothing's changed. Still going to work. Right? So now we've got a custom hook, and we can share this. We put this in a file in a code base somewhere. And people can use a timer in their component. So say if you have timer company or timer incorporated, and you have all these different timers, well, you might have a bunch of different components for those different variations of timers. And now you can just call use timer, and it doesn't care about your UI. It's just going to give you the seconds, the updater functions, and the is active, right? So what if I also wanted to log the state filled out, like in the console for some reason? What I want to make sure I also convey here is hooks are just functions, and so you can compose them, right? So let's make a custom hook to log something out to the console. So we'll say function use logging, and I might want to pass in like what I actually want to log, right? So we'll pass in a value, and we want this to run any component that we call this custom hook in. We want it to run every time that component renders, right? So we're going to use effect, and in that function, we're going to console.log. Let's see, value updated, whatever you want to say here. All right, and we only want this to actually run if the value that we're tracking has changed. So there's that optional dependency array. If we don't pass this dependency array in, that is optional, but if we don't pass it in, it's going to run on every render, and that's probably not what you want. If you only wanted this, also, if you only wanted this to run one time when the component mounts, do an empty array. And so this means that I'm not tracking anything, so I don't really care about when the component updates. I just want this to run once and be done. But we actually want this to run every time this value changes. So now if I come back in our timer, I can say use logging and pass it seconds. So every time seconds changes, it's going to run through this. The effect's going to run because seconds will be new, and it's going to get logged. The new value is going to get logged to the console. So if we open the console, we've got the initial render, right? I don't know if you can, if we see this. Yeah, and then if we hit start, it's going to run every time seconds is updated. Now we can take this one more step further, and we can compose these hooks together. So say you want to use timer with logging. We can function use timer with logging, all right? And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take these two, put them here, return the same array, and now I'm going to call use timer with logging. So same array, use timer with logging. So this is kind of a dumb example, can try, but you can compose the hooks together as many as you want, and you can even mix and match them, and I think that's pretty awesome because the hooks still don't care about the UI. Like if I go back now, just to prove that it works, it still works. But the hooks don't care about the UI, and so they only care about the logic, the state you're tracking, and you can still have control over what's happening after the components that use them, what's happening after those components render. So that is hook composition. So moving on, there are some other hooks. There's use context, which it would set up a context. There's use memo, which is kind of replacing should component update. So this is for like optimizations. Use reducer. So if you're a big Redux fan like me, and you want like a dispatch action kind of state machine, you can use reducer. Use ref. You used to have to use classes for that. If you wanted to actually manipulate these down directly, or maybe work with some third-party library like D3 or something, you usually would use a ref probably. And there's others too, like there's many more. So the best way to learn about these is the docs, which is here, reactjs.org/hooks. The docs are so good, like so good on this feature. They're very approachable, and so I definitely recommend checking them out. One more thing worth mentioning is the rules of hooks. There's 2 rules. You can only call hooks at the top level of a component. So anything, you cannot put a hook inside anything that might not execute, like a condition, because hooks, React actually relies on the order that you've defined all of your hooks and kind of initialized all of them in your component in order to keep track of what is what, because under the hood, I think it's just like a big array and they know what index is which state value. So if there's a chance that could get off, then React won't be able to give you the proper values and you'll get off. And so seconds might become is active or something like that. So you can't call them inside anything where it's possible it wouldn't execute. The next one is you can only call them from React functions. So you have to call them from components or custom hooks, which if you put them in custom hook, you have to call the custom hook from a React component. So you can't just put them in any JavaScript function. You have to be putting them in a function that you intend to call inside of a React component. And that's it for today. I'm around today and tonight. I would love to meet people. Again, if you're looking for a new job, I would also love to talk to you because we need to hire a lot of engineers at the moment. And thank you for coming to my talk.